no further ado, I think you all know our facilitator today, Fernando Espana. He's the president over at ConstructX, regularly coordinating lots of great content for you all. Welcome again, happy to have him back. We have Mark Childerson, who is the founder of Garner, and Rick Dunlap, who is a VP of Technical Services at Brand Safeway. They are here today to present to you, and without further ado, I'll go ahead and let them take the stage. Thanks, guys.
All right, thank you, Jenny. Happy to be here again for another installment of our AWP plus Lean Joint Working Group webinars. So let's go ahead. So as you know, and I've shared this before, so just a reminder, we have a lot of great companies that are involved with this joint working group, and it is shared by myself and John Strickland, the collaborative flow. So we're bringing the AWP knowledge and the Lean knowledge together, along with others as well that are part of this joint working group. Go ahead to the next one. And at any rate, so again, we've been around since 2021, really working on this in a big way, really trying to raise awareness of AWP Lean, Operation Science, and other these best practices all around improving project delivery. That's our key goal here. And where can we get it? You know, that's so we really want to create solution sets for the industry, and not something that's just out of, you know, hey, brand new, out of the box, never been done before stuff. But how do we take what's already in the world today and take these great best practices and blend them into an approach that might be creating something brand new for an organization or a project or the industry itself? Just because taking best practice and using it differently, you know, is always a key thing. Besides just being better at what we do, whether you're in advanced work packaging, lean construction, or operation science, there's so much to improve just on the practice is great. All right, go ahead and go to the next one. So yes, today is site material management, AWP plus Lean, you know, operation science, you know, that perspective. Next month, we're going to hold one on contracting strategy and requirements. And then after that, some look ahead planning and production control from a little different perspective on our AWP plus Lean and what people are contributing. Go ahead to the next one. So today's team, and thank you, Jenny, you introduced us. We've got today with us, we have Mark Childerson with Garner and Rick Dunlap with Brand Safeway. Robert Lowe has been out of touch today. He's not able to make it. I think he's in the middle of traveling, got stuck. So we're trying to do the best we can with Rob's material and go through what his part of the presentation is. So I'll be delivering that and as best as I can. So apologies if you're expecting to see Rob Lowe here today. Unfortunately, not able to make it. So what are our desired outcomes from this webinar? One is to gain an appreciation of the contributions and benefits in developing a well-integrated supply chain. That material flows across the project life cycle can be optimized, right? Go to the next one. Understand how applying AWP, Lean, and or operation science principles are essential. Now, we're not going to get everything right, but we're moving towards a goal of improving our whole project delivery program through materials management. Gain an understanding of the practical applications, you know, people, process, and technology as best we can, and optimizing supply chain, and of course, increases transparency and accountability to drive next-gen solutions, which is this blending. So that's what we're hoping to get out. For those of you that are familiar with Lean, you know, I thought it would be important to just share the Lean principles, right? So what are the principles of waste, the learning to see component, I'd like to say, right? Everybody recognize these categories: over, under production, waiting, unnecessary transportation, over, under processing, you know, excess inventory, unnecessary motion, defects, unused capacity of team members, right? So these are the classics, right? Everybody understands that, whether you're manufacturing and construction. So how does materials fit into this, right? So producing the right materials at the right time, clearly a goal. Materials arrive on time and easily located, right? So we're not spending a lot of time searching. The right logistics strategy off and on site. You know, how am I going to optimize? Eliminating or reducing material prep or assembly, right? How do I get that? And there's a little bit of the DFMA and design for manufacturing and assembly, right? Along with Lean programs. You know, we want to minimize the staging and warehousing of inventory. Sometimes we just build, if we have the acres, we fill the acres with stuff, right? Minimal searching for or moving materials on site, is that unnecessary motion? Defects, removing and preventing defects on and off site, that's what we really want to do. And of course, I like the last one, unused creativity of team members. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. Let's really take the minds of people on our team and not shut them down, but open up and listen to what people have to say. Great ideas are just sitting in the room if we just listen and let people share. Okay, now we can go, I believe. So I'm going to deliver what Rob was talking about. You know, what does good look like? So let's just look at it. Global approach to safety. You know, clearly, whatever we have, we want to have a safe site. You know, global approach to quality. You know, clearly how we move materials, we want them to be moving in the right way, so nothing gets damaged, the right stuff arrives at the right time. Right? Stewardship. Who is responsible for what, and how does that move through the supply chain? Somebody needs to manage that. Somebody needs to organize that. Right? And approach to schedule efficiency. In AWP and lean, it's getting the right things to the right place at the right time, and not too much of it, right? We don't want to have large inventories and things out there. And I know all of you have experienced this. There's stuff that's sitting out in their field that's probably doesn't even need it to be there for a year, but we've got a procurement process, and it drives the wrong kind of behaviors. So the global approach to packaging and material handling equipment and standardization. Right? How are we going to move things on site? How are we going to move things in between sites and interim staging areas? Right? As things get delivered from the source all the way through to its final destination, which is an install. Go ahead to the next one. All right. This is always the fun one. What does good not look like? And this might look familiar to you. You know, a bunch of materials just stacked in there, not organized, and this is the well-leveled machine, and C-Box does a lot of transportation. Our fields can be just strewn with materials. So things are tagged, we can't find stuff. And then if we can't find it, we rob Peter to pay Paul, basically chop things up or put the wrong material in. And then of course, we've got lots of rework going, right? A lot of inventory sitting on trucks, just sit there, right? So we've got stuff that we don't need for a long period of time, or just a lot of stock stuff just sitting out in the field, just waiting to be used. Right, even our delivery systems, and we're getting lots of bulk, whether they're coming by rail or coming by ship. Right, this arrives, and you know, where's it going? Is it tagged properly? You know, and how do I deliver it? I have to keep rehandling, you know, materials. It's just a lot of waste in the system. And I know most of you can see this, is that yes, we need to have a lot of materials, and they're just filling space, just filling a lot of space. And how often well, here's a trucking example. Yes, so we got all this, so we move it once, put it in place. Now we got to move it again, and you know, it'd certainly be better if we manage it in smaller sections. Now, major pipeline job, maybe this is what you need to get the next month done. But you know, how much do I really need, and how often do I need it? You know, so this isn't really what we want, but it does sort of kind of give us an idea of what's really happening out there and in the field. So you know, Rob has been on, you know, been 35 years in supply chain. You know, so he wants to optimize. He wants to look at avoidance of costs, achieve. You know, overcomes achieved when physical packaging of project materials start at the origin, supplier, fabricator, manufacturer, and continues through the destination to the delivery of the work phase. So it's a very holistic process, and it's very complex, right? Things are coming from all different sources, right? And how do you manage that? Or do you not manage it? Do you manage it by contracts? And you know, there's a lot of strategies that have to come in place here. So again, intermodal transfers, and what do we see? Physical packaging materials constantly deliver quantifiable and replicable step change. You know, what can we do? Indirect man hours associated with materials and logistics management, 50 to 70%. You know, material handling equipment cost, 50%. Material laydown space, 50 to 75%. Shipping containers, trailer loading and unloading times, 90 to 96%. Right, if these are areas where we can save these kind of dollars, how should we better organize ourselves? Right, so in advanced work packaging, you know, we have the ability to define very discrete elements of work for a work package, what the components are. And so if we can get into the organization of that material, right, and ship to that requirement, right, and receive it the way we need to receive it, keep going. right? And I can deliver a work package, on a pallet. In this case, this is what we're looking at, some C-box materials here that enable us to do that, not only in, working in the transportation from a source to the final installation site, but also on site, right? So how do we organize? And, not that you have to use these kind of materials, but bagging and tagging, is trying to replicate this as much as we can. So when we get to the site, we know exactly where things are and they're packaged the right way, and we can find what we need quite rapidly. All right. So just more materials. So the idea here is, look, if we were really going to package the materials, especially from an advanced work packaging, and we want to see that group, because people, obviously bad practices say, I'm making all the big stuff, I'm going to ship all the big stuff, and you might need the small stuff later on. But if I can work with my supply chain and deliver what I need in a package format, I got a crew that can be very, very efficient at the end of the day, right? So I can package by installation work package for the most part is really the objective here. So I think these are just more examples of the same thing. And I know Rob would probably have a lot more to say about that, but I've seen his presentation before and I kind of understand the message he wants to provide. But if you're going to deliver at the end of the day, a package, make sure it's together and organized that way, so we can pull something off of a shelf and into a, well, in this case, there might be an organized warehouse, but from the warehouse and on site into a site use condition. All right. So I think these are just more examples, taggings and work package kind of strategies. But then again, this doesn't happen by accident. It actually gets planned, and you need to start way back with a contracting strategy that supports it. So yes, let's yeah, this is just more of his. So let's go ahead and switch horses. We'll go with Mark, I believe.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Mark or Rick, if you want to add anything to that. I think you may have seen Rob's presentation before.
Yeah, sure. I thanks, Fernando. That's very good. Certainly, if ConstructX gives you problems, you can always perhaps go work at C-Box with Rob. I think what we saw in the C-Box slides was a lot of organization of materials in space, right? Instead of to me, the overall takeaway from that is, instead of having a big yard of materials just scattered hither and yon in a kind of homogeneous piles, you're putting them in those IWSs, you're putting them in those shelving units, you're grouping them together, you're creating organization. And with what Fernando told us about the start, he was talking about the lean principles of waste, right? And the one that and excess and overproduction obviously is something that we have to worry about. Not so much overproduction. We're not going to build 2 LNG export facilities when we only want to build 1. But overproduction of materials, and obviously mislaid materials or lost materials, can lead to overpurchasing of materials. But the other thing, the second source of waste that I really want to focus on is weighting. And weighting can be either materials waiting for people in work in process, and we know from the operation science and PPM view that we don't want to have too much work in process, or even worse, people waiting for materials because we haven't received them on time. And so we've looked at a bunch of pictures of organizing materials in space, and now what I want to talk about is organizing materials in time, reaching back further in the supply chain to get the materials organized in the right time, so that when they come to your site, they're there when you need them, but they're not there too early or in the wrong order, because all of those, as the way we've seen optimizing materials in space on the IWSs and other kind of organization, that saves you time at the work phase on site, because you're not looking for materials, you're not reorganizing materials, you're not hunting here and there, and organizing your materials in time so that they arrive at or near the job site when you need them means that you're saving on space. You don't need the same amount of laydown area. You don't need the same amount of shakeout area to do those organization, to do the grouping. So the time can save space and the space can save time. And so to organize the materials in time, it's a little trickier than organizing them in space. You can't just kind of see them all in front of you. You've got to see them with your mind's eye or with your computer system. And to do that, you got to get the right data. And so what we're going to do is take a look at the supply chain and think about that, because that is organizing the materials in time. And so what is the supply chain really? We think of it as the life story of all the materials all together, from the time of the original requisition right through to their installation at the work face. And I'm not going to talk today about the entire supply chain in that vision. I'm going to talk about the most challenging and the most difficult part of it. And that's from issuing the purchase order to the vendor to delivery of those materials at or near the final consumption site, either in a laydown or actually right to site itself. And the reason why that's in many ways the most challenging part of the supply chain is basically the diversity of people involved. There's vendors, there's carriers, there's freight forwarders. If they're international materials, there's customs brokers, there's governments involved. There's a whole lot of people, and organizing all those people to work together and keeping them communicating is a very, very difficult task. And if that breaks down, then that's going to make your materials come in a suboptimal time sequence, and that is going to lead to problems on site because you either have too many materials or too few. So look at a couple examples of those stories of the materials. And so the first one is a story of a material that came early. And so we can see that the required on-site date for that material was September 30th. The purchase order was issued on January 15th, and the vendor promised that it would be delivered or ready on May 10th and was shipped on May 10th, or would be shipped on May 10th, and delivery on site on June 26th. So already it's like, well, why is it coming 3 months before we want it? We can't really tell from this set of data, which is the kind of data that you might get in a track and trace system. You know, we have those forecast plan dates, and we know when it was issued, we know when it was shipped, and we know when it was delivered. Okay, and we can see problems that arrived 90 days early, and that is a material cost. Pardon me, overuse the word material, because it increases preservation costs and it increases laydown space. And people often do that because they don't trust their supply chain, but it's expensive. But here's why they do that, of course. Some materials come late. So we have a material that was purchase issue, PO was issued on January 15th. The vendor promised it on May 10th. And for some reason, our system has a recorded ship date or a forecast ship date of June 5th. This is the kind of thing that you might see in smart plant materials or anything else. So that's a bit puzzling. Later than the vendor promised. We can see also that the material was inspected on May 5th and it was shipped on June 5th as expected but not promised. And it arrived 3 weeks late for the delivery. It arrived on July 20th rather than the required date of June 30th. And so we're thinking, well, why? Well, firstly, what is the outcome? It's a bad outcome. It came 3 weeks after the required date, which could have impacted the construction schedule or could have simply caused people to want more and more float. And so why did that happen? Well, we can't easily tell, but it looks like it was the vendor's fault. And so this is the kind of data that you get in a track and trace system, but I want to suggest to you that that is insufficient. I want to show you the kind of data that we track in Garner and the kind of data that I think people really need. So now we see for the first material, I'm going to look at the same two materials. We see that the first material on January 1st, its required date was set to June 30th. And the PO was issued on January 15th. And then on January 18th, the vendor acknowledged the PO and had a promised date of May 10th and a forecast ship date of May 10th with a forecast delivery of June 24th. This all looks very good, the way it should be. Everybody's doing their job properly. Now the required on-site date was changed to September 30th. And maybe that was because of a construction change of schedule. Could be any number of things, happens all the time. But no one did anything about it. The material was shipped per the original plan on May 12th, more or less, and arrived on site June 24th, according to the original schedule. But because no one acted on that change in requirement date, and maybe they could have, maybe we had a contract with the vendor that would have allowed us to delay that purchase order in practice. It arrived early. And so that was the real cause, not an error in procurement, not an error in the vendor, it was the required on-site date changing. And similarly for the late material, we can look at its life cycle. On January 1st, it was required on site June 30th. Okay, great. PO was issued. The vendor acknowledged with a promised date and a forecast ship date consistent with that required date, all good. But this material, as we saw, needed an inspection. And so on April 1st, the vendor asked QA to do an inspection and said, can we have that inspection scheduled for April 10th? But for some reason, QA missed the message and didn't get onto it until April 21st. And then April 21st, they said, yeah, we'll come and inspect it on May 5th. Okay, that's quite a bit later than the vendor wanted it, nearly a month later. And so the next day, the vendor revised their forecast ship date and forecast delivery. Now they know it's going to be late. It was inspected on May 5th per QA's promise, and it was shipped on June 5th and arrived on site on July 20th, 3 weeks late. And so we see that it was a delayed inspection that caused it. Now, capturing this kind of data is really important, not just so that you know the story. It's not about playing a blame game and saying, oh, okay, it was your fault when we thought it was this other person's fault. The real purpose of capturing this data is to create an environment where you can take proactive action, right? Because if you're capturing the data and you're using the data in a system, you can do something about it. You can maybe delay the materials coming. You can say, hey, QA, you got to get on top of this. If you know that it's coming late to site, you can perhaps reorganize your IWP schedule so that you're not causing delays. You can take some kind of action. But to take any action, you first need to capture this data. And so how do you go about capturing this data? Well, you need a system that lets you capture that data. And so this is the Garner system. We do supply chain visibility and collaboration, as you can see. And the key to any system that can capture this kind of data is configurability, right? Because everybody has different processes. The request for an inspection scheduled as a particular date. There's the shipping release. Sometimes you have to get approval from construction to release a shipment. Sometimes you don't. The processes are complex. The processes are variable. You need a system that can capture whatever process it is into your software. Because if all those key things are happening in email or maybe in spreadsheets, you don't have that data, you don't have that visibility, you don't know what's going on, and you can't do anything about it. Similarly, you need to capture the changes, right? Everybody knows, yeah, we've got plan date, we've got forecast date, we've got actual, plan, forecast, actual. But the evolution of those forecasts over time, the changes of those forecasts over time are critical. You actually need to capture all of them. You need a system that lets you capture all of them. And to do that, you need a system that everybody can access. Again, if people can't access a system or it can't integrate with the system where they already have this data, they're going to send emails, they're going to send spreadsheets. You need a system that's shared, that everybody can jump into, everybody can use, and everybody can do the actions they need very, very easily. So again, this points to that high degree of configurability. And so once you've got that in your supply chain, then people can start cooperating. So it's not good enough to just share the data as uploaded files, as spreadsheets, as whatever. You need that real-time supply chain system that helps you cooperate together in order to capture that most important data. And then once you've got it, you're not capturing the data just for interest's sake. You're capturing the data to take action. And you're capturing that data to take two kinds of action. The first kind of action, and really, in our view, the most important, is to stop problems before they cause delays. So if you had known that the vendor had requested that inspection on April 10th, or on April 1st was when they requested it, and then 2, 3, 4 days later, QA still had not got back to them with the schedule, you could have reminded QA, the manager of QA, the vendor might have known and said, hey, you're missing that inspection, get on top of it. Making it visible lets people intervene, lets people expedite the process. And so the Garner system, and any system you could do for this, lets you configure those alerts by the people, by the user groups, to really spot the problems, not to focus on everything that's going well. If everything's going well, you don't care, nobody cares. If there's a problem, that's what you got to deal with. So you have to be able to identify those and correct them before they lead to delays in delivery. And then you also need to be able to visualize the performance over time, because while it's true we don't want a blame game, we do want an ability to improve, to work with vendors to do better, to know how they're doing, to give them a pat on the head when they're doing well, and to give them encouragement and instruction when they're having trouble. And so that means you need to capture all of the data to know the full story and be able to visualize it, to monitor the trends in performance, and to catch the outliers. And if you can do all of that, then you can keep your supply chain running smoothly and well as best it can. And when there's a problem that you can't fix, you know about it. And that way, you can keep your materials on site and in your laydowns clean, organized, as they should be, to keep everything running well and totally reduce your administrative and management and site materials load. Okay, so now we've talked about that. We've talked about space. We've talked about time. I'm going to turn you over to Rick, who's going to talk about scaffolding, how it's part of the materials and part of the management. Okay, Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, appreciate it. I'm not sure why scaffolding keeps getting brought into these discussions, but I think it's for good reason, right? And I want to go back to Rob's point, right? And Rob's point and some of the points I'm going to make are really, if we allow the folks at the tool level to be the ones doing some of the support activities or planning for the bag and tag, then you're going to end up with thousands of bag and tag routines. And Rob's point is we should bag and tag at the package level, right? In ways that have been a little unconventional perhaps in the past, but I think make good sense. And I'm gonna cover some of the commercial stuff that I think is real important. I keep kind of beating this drum a little bit, but the point really is that no matter how lean our teams can be, if we can't overcome some of the system infrastructure inefficiencies, then we're going to be kind of stuck in that quagmire of, am I having an impact? That didn't work. What can I do better? So I'm going to touch on that just a little bit. Then I'm going to share some real basic lean playbook examples from our team. And then I'm going to rehash sort of the areas of waste, a simpler view, and give a little history on that. And then just show a real simple side example of how we can make a significant impact to the amount of material and the amount of hours that we've spent on a project just by using basic lean concepts. Go ahead. So you can go ahead and click one more, right? So I think everywhere a project starts is sort of, what's the project funded at? And what are those assumptions? Who are we going to hire? What's my ROI? It's really the star we're going to navigate to as a project, not just an individual contractor. So immediately that becomes sort of, here's our strategy. We're going to go write a contract for our piping teams, our equipment teams. We're going to buy all the materials. We're going to do all those things. And the pieces, while not connected, could still probably fit together. What happens a lot of times is, and I would argue that we really need to lean the contracting process out, to be perfectly honest. But what happens a lot of times, especially when you think about us as access providers, we're very far down the food chain, and we end up looking back up the ladder of providers on a job site, and we'll see dozens and dozens of approaches and methods and data standards that we're expected to comply with. So it's very hard for us to be lean in that scenario. So go ahead, Mark. So one of the really cool things about AWP to us is that it sort of helps us all talk the same language. It allows us to all talk about the data in a standard way and have those standards. And sort of the last piece, especially for us, as if you think about how we're treated as a constraint on a project, especially for folks like us. We're not engineering, we're not installing the pipe or the vessels, but we're a significant amount of the resource on the project site, and we're very critical to the success of those key resources on the job site. So I think the better we work together, the leaner we make this process, the better that our lean efforts as individuals can actually get traction. So that was my sermon on that. to sort of roll this up again, when we've had very large Six Sigma and lean initiatives internally at our organization in the past, where we had numerous black belts, we did tons of lean events. And when we go to the field and try to really influence people in the field, one of the first things that happens is that sort of that lean or Six Sigma language starts to become a barrier to people. They start to kind of gloss over when they hear some of the terminology. So one of the things we do is try to simplify it. We try to be very illustrative to say, I can build the same amount of work with 10 individual efforts. And here's how I spent my man hours. If I could do that perfectly, I could have done that with perhaps 3 scaffolds or 3 work activities. The point is that we want to go from 10 and navigate to that 3. So if we only get halfway, I'm still making a significant improvement. I might not be perfect, but I am directionally on the improvement path. And so if you notice, again, if you see the math added up in underneath the illustrations, we're really looking at the components or categories of hours or opportunity areas for us to influence with lean typically. And so the next slide will show us, how can I influence my workers' tool time? How can I influence my workers' safety process time, my workers' material logistics time, job travel, and those type of things. So what we do is synthesize it down into a really simple playbook by craft typically. And we'll say, hey, we're talking about how can I lean out my teams to be more efficient as a process. We might be talking about leverage and synergies. We might be talking about how can I make the direct work more productive. And then sometimes we talk about the contract things. How can I use the contract levers to help us be more effective? In this case, I'm focused purely on the crew's productivity. And you can see where we've baselined a particular example job site, project site, and we said, hey, here's what it takes today to do X. Here's what we spend in terms of material logistics. Here's what we spend on average in terms of job travel, safety process, and maybe non-job travel. Just, if we're on a project site, we might have 200, 500, 350 people on site. If they're all wandering around trying to figure out where they can use the facility, get a drink of water, or eat their lunch, there's a huge opportunity for lean in some of those scenarios. I think the industry in general has taken that one away and off the table. They figured that one out on their own. But there are other categories where we can make a direct impact. So this would be a playbook for us, easy to explain. Our field teams, whether it's an entry-level project control person or an entry-level supervisor, they can get these concepts and we can apply them. So the next slide. So again, when we think about waste, I don't have the more modern version that Fernando shared, but I really do like the one, number 8 on your list is no idea is a bad idea, quite honestly. And the people doing the work are the ones that usually can help us solve some of the challenges. We just have to figure out how to get their creativity and their ideas into the mix. But the one I'm going to focus on today is really about inventory. And I think Rob's slide showed that we're typically way over inventoried on job sites because we're not very good at scheduling and aligning all those folks. And then maybe one other, go ahead, Mark, if you don't mind, I just highlight sort of what I'm going to talk about, the unnecessary motion, right? And so Rob's point, I think, was very valid, is if I force my individual craft teams to go through that 50-acre, 100-acre laydown area to try to find one valve and a small piece of pipe, how effective or productive are they going to be? Same thing goes in our business, where we might have 500,000 or 1 million pieces of scaffold on a job site. If I have 50 supervision personnel out driving around looking for individual components, that's not very effective. The other piece is if we don't worry about optimizing our inventory, we might have 20, 30, 40 million dollars of scaffold equipment, 50 million on a job site, where I could have efficiently done that same work with 10 million. Not to mention, when we're in the critical nature of a project and all the piping, all the equipment, all the cranes are taking the critical space to get work done, if I have a giant slug of scaffold sitting right in the middle of everybody's way, it's not very effective to others, right? So the next slide. So we did a study, that same man-hour breakdown. We broke this down, said, hey, it took on average 8 across 10,000 scaffolds in the study. If I go implement these minor changes to our process just internally, I can have a significant impact just in the amount of labor or manpower required, not to mention the amount of material and equipment to support those workers on site and the work. So an operational view of what's that really mean? And next slide, please. An operational view of that might be, hey, if I can make a significant impact on the amount of time my crews travel to find their materials, or our material logistics support team has to go to provide materials to people at the workface, I can make a significant impact to the project. And so here would be an example of us looking like a typical 3-week look ahead, this week, next week, the following week, and where is all the work activity going to be, and where should I be staging my equipment in the most optimal amount. This is an example of a project going back 5 or 6 years ago that we did. I changed the plot plan and some of the numbers to protect the innocent, but I think you get the idea. So we love lean. I think it has its place. Just remember that a project is an ecosystem. An individual contractor could overperform by 20 or 30% if some of the fundamental barriers built into the project don't allow that to come to the surface. Then it's a warm feeling in a dark suit, right? Sometimes. So appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you. And if we look at this from what Rick is presenting here, it represents the opportunity to have a shared resources to drive efficiency across a project, serving multiple folks. Otherwise, what typically we see is everybody has this, I provide my own scaffold, you provide your own scaffold, on and on and on, and we each run into each other all the time. And I think the savings, and there is a report that's out with CII on scaffold management, and I got the pleasure of working with Rick on this, and looking at how do we look at the opportunity, and the figures that were coming out from several scaffolding manufacturers was, hey, we could probably save 25 to 30 or more % off the cost and time that it takes to put scaffolding together if we can get alignment across the supply chain, right? And if we think of scaffolding as a shared service, what are the other things that are shared services? We could look at equipment. And I got the privilege of being out on some early lean projects, and one of the classic ones, if you ever want to go read about it, is T5 at Heathrow Airport, where shared services were also how do we distribute concrete across an entire massive program, or provide rebar, and how do we smooth out that demand and supply, So there's a lot of great work, and we can't cover everything in this webinar, but a huge amount of things that touch AWP and how that contributes, lean and operation science. And if that's the end game, right, making people efficiency, how do you support that? You need the data. You need to understand the material flows that support that, where it's all coming from. And we could have, 80 different vendors, sending materials to the job, and how is that coordinated? And if we don't get our data right, and extract the data, which requires integrated systems, which is what Mark was explaining, all these complexities and all these dynamics, right, can be viewed, we can be displayed, we can visualize them in our models where things are. So site materials management, we can look at it from this very, very broad perspective, how we eliminate lean. But the sense is, hey, if we don't understand the end game on our turnover, in this case, making our people out in the field highly efficient, right? We're not going to start out the right way. So what is that, right? And so that's kind of the opportunity that we're looking at in better managing just the material flows to the site. And there's a lot to be said about this. And I know that there's a lot of opinions from the lean side, from the ADP side, but proactively addressing it, I think, is key. So I think we're got about 20 minutes left. So we'll go ahead. I think we're opening up for questions right after this, and we'll try to get to see some already coming in. So if you have questions, come in, and we have other topics to talk about if we want to fill in the space. So let's see. I'm going to start out with one. Have you come across an old rule of thumb that 2/3 of labor costs, almost without regard to type of project, are moving materials around? That makes it pretty clear that it deserves our attention. So anybody else feel strongly about that? Want to comment about the amount of labor that it takes to manage the materials that's unnecessary, probably a waste? Mark or Rick, got any comments? Oh, you're on mute.
Fernando, I think that's a really good point. And I think another thing that we can bear in mind is that if we're running lean, we're planning not to have a lot of materials in our laydown yard. We're planning to have things organized pretty well. And that means that an error, if instead of we're running with a month material, we're running our supply chain poorly and we have 3 months material, that means we're tripling our laydown space, we're tripling our material handling labor, we're causing a huge increase. So this kind of organization can have a completely disproportionate impact. So I totally would believe that 2/3 on material handling. Like that's what we're doing, right? Is we're picking stuff up and installing it. And if we pick it up and carry it around, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, so totally agree. And one of the things that we see is the duplication, right? So again, we're very focused on providing that shared service internally within our organization to minimize the amount of material logistics, whether we're on insulation or scaffold or whatever it may be. Some of those can become 30 or 40% of our man hours on a project, just moving boxes of insulation around, stuffing them in a trailer, unstuffing them, searching through them, dragging them to the pipe rack. Same with scaffold. So again, the look ahead perspective, repeatable process around how much gear am I actually supposed to have and what are the specific components ahead of time, sort of the C-box idea, is that pre-kit or that bag and tag for scaffold or insulation is critical for that exact reason. So it's an easy way for us to lean the job.
Yeah, and you know, I've done a lot of work on the lean side, and one of the biggest questions that we would ask a lot of these customers, supply chain members, and contractors is how much time they spent searching for things. I don't care if it's searching for information or searching materials. And we were surprised by the answers we would get, right? And they would easily say 25% of my time is done searching, right? And some would of course hire, and others believe they didn't have a problem at all. And then you dig in and say, oh yes, okay, I got this. But that's a staggering amount of information. Yes, there is some searching you always got to do, you know. But hey, how do we make it easier for people not to spend that time? And a lot of time is totally unnecessary. Go ahead.
Yeah, not to tell on ourselves, right? Is we bought all the right pieces. We procured them in a perfectly aligned fashion, as Mark described. We stuffed them in a trailer, and we went to go complete an IWP on an insulation project and couldn't find those prefabricated components. So we drug bulk material out, fabricated those components from bulk material. And at the end of the job, when we ran out of all the bulk material, guess what we found? We found all those components that were in some box somewhere, right? Pretty wild. So it has, so the point is that it also has downstream consequences, leads to other waste types, right? So,
right. And I will add something I think was kind of hinted on before, is if you don't put a solid plan together using AWP planning techniques or lean planning techniques, I mean really planning and looking at those constraints, you can get massive disruptions when things don't happen. And for instance, I was working on a precast project and looking at issues and a disruption from the contractor's view, changing their plan around, made massive issues for the precaster. Instead of, you know, acres of material, I mean, literally about a square mile of very highly polished pre-finished panels that couldn't stand the sun, right? So, but they had no place to put it. So all this effort to move things and find things, it just became a nightmare. So, you know, part of the process when we talk about AWP plus lean is let's have strong planning process in place so we can lessen those disruptions in an already, you know, highly dynamic and problematic area. So bringing these tools in kind of help us. So let me go to the next one here. If this sounds a bit like just-in-time procurement, how do you avoid the pitfalls of just-in-time in this process? That's a good question. So I don't know if I can start out with that. Yes. Yes, go ahead, Mark.
I mean, just in time, there's degrees of just in time, right? Like as Fernando talked about, they were running T5 on a 30-second just in time, or the auto industry here in Canada and Ontario is very, very tight. So I don't think we're going to attain that anytime soon in the construction industry because it's not going to be that close, right? But there's degrees of just in time, and it's something that you can always push. And with enough communication of what's going on, with enough understanding, you can tighten up that supply chain. And with enough visibility in advance, when problems really happen, you can alleviate them or you can adapt to them. So there's always a trade-off, right? Everyone thinks, well, I'd rather be able to I'd rather have the material sitting in front of me than have to go look for it. And sure, you would at the time that you need it, but there are costs associated with that. And so what you want to do is not be sloppy about your supply chain, run it as best you can, and then narrow down your just-in-time window to fit as much as you can do and optimize your costs. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, just-in-time really doesn't work in construction like you think. I believe, and from an AWP perspective, we talk about bagging and tagging and even lean deliveries, and I've seen this work marvelously in lean, is what is just-in-time? Where do you need just-in-time? And that is delivery at the work face, right? So if you can bag and tag and do whatever you need to do to get the materials at the work face, that means something somewhere else is taking up that variability, right, in the system. So, and I'll go back to T5, and you look at these logistics centers, which absorb that variability in the system, and it's getting worse, not better right now, right? All I hear is complaining, well, we have to put in our contracts so early because we can't get guarantees from a supply chain to deliver stuff, and it's longer delivery periods. So we need more of these systems in place, not less, and we need flexibility in place and not less. So the fact is, yes, just in time is not a strategy that I would promote if you're just talking about straight from the supplier. Doesn't work. But if you talk about just in time to the work face in a packaged environment, absolutely we can do that. But that variability needs to get absorbed somewhere outside, whether it's bulk items, engineered to order, made to order, or some prefab or pre-assembly where we can do quality checks right in time. And what does that buffer look like? Needs to be planned by the project, of course, and the complexity and the size. But that's where we need to kind of focus. Okay, so I've got another question. What stakeholders have access to the critical supply chain data that Mark showed? Owner, EPC, contractor, supplier, all of them, or just a few have access and visibility to the data? Who decides who gets access to this data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In my ideal world, it would be everybody. In practice, that's not really achievable on some projects. And so, in our field, we often contract with the EPCs, we often contract with the owners, we sometimes contract with both. In fact, that's probably more common. And they work together to decide. And so one of the big lean principles is collaboration, is transparency, is sharing. And AWP is about creating that as well. And so what you want to do is share that information as widely as possible. And it does create a culture of collaboration. People hate being blamed for mistakes, no question about it. But they hate being blamed for other people's mistakes a heck of a lot more than they hate being blamed for their own mistakes. And if we get to the stage where everyone just knows, you know what, we all make mistakes. This is the real world. We all make mistakes. But if we work together to share that information as quickly as possible and to correct them as much as we can, people do feel better about that, and they do find it easier to work together effectively. So in the system, in our system, you can control who can see that data. And obviously vendor A can't see vendor B's expediting data. But in practice, it's good to share it as widely as you can.
And it's actually very critical to share it when we're talking about AWP in terms of the ability to people see where materials are at any one point, just as it is engineering, right? What is ready or not ready? Because it's all about readiness and it's all about the time of that readiness, right? So if we want to put something, get the data and have that engine always working, and then we can extract the data, right, to deliver it to the people that need to know the information that is that. If things are going to be late, we don't want to. It's like what Mark said earlier. Hey, if things are late, we need to inform people that this work package or this area of focus for the project is going to fall apart. Go ahead, Rick. What was that?
Yeah, I was saying that tells all the rest of the providers we need to pivot, right? That's sort of the beauty of AWP having CWPs and IWPs. It doesn't have to every IWP doesn't have to be critical path, but I think I hear a theme, right? I hear a theme in traditional construction methodology and culture and mindset of perfection or nothing. And I'm a very big advocate for direction. We'll get to perfection, right? And try not to tamp down the change because it's not perfect yet. But we certainly know that perfection hasn't been achieved yet. So
And it never will be.
No. Hey, the journey's the fun part, right? As long as we're improving, if we ever get there, it'll be kind of boring. But
Exactly right.
yeah. So, all right, I'll go to the next question. What is the lowest level of AWP adoption required to take advantage of the lean supply chain? So that's a really interesting question. And the way I want to answer it is depends on your organization, because you're going to get failures, right? There's no one starts this journey and doesn't run into obstacles. But if you are bought into the principle of AWP or into lean, right, you know that it makes total sense to go do it, but you have to stick with it because not every member is going to play by the same rules. So if you look at the lowest level, if you're adopting it and you are collaborating, because you can collaborate at any level, getting your supply chain involved is one of the very first steps you can do. Now, getting them involved to the extent that we're talking about takes a lot of other things, and we haven't talked about yet. But how do we align the contracts so people can behave the right way? Right, that's a whole nother topic in itself, and I think that's critical. But from the lowest level of AWP, you're on your journey. The first thing you're going to learn is how do I, in any kind of path of construction environment, how do I involve all my partners in coming up with what the path forward is, and knowing that it has to refine all the time, and you're going to learn more. If you think that first POC is the end game, then we're not aligned in what we think AWP, the benefit of AWP is. But to me, it is that journey that we just mentioned, and the fact is, engage supply chain at any level, and you'll discover a lot of great things. All right, can you describe studies in which you tracked how many times a piece of material is handled? I recall 9 to 11 times for a conduit and pipe. There you go. Anybody? I don't know if I'm sure there's a lot of time on tool studies that do that, but it's when you look at what happens and something gets delivered, actually talk about the time it leaves the factory and all the points where you have to move it, store it, put it, reload it, all that kind of thing. And then it gets to the site and you put it in a place, and this is some of the stuff that Rob was showing. Sometimes you put that material right where you got to go work later on, right? And you got to pick it up, move it someplace else, and then that's in somebody's way, or now you're searching it, you're looking for pile. So yeah, I think it would be an interesting study, and it might shock us all as to how. But I have not actually seen a study that measures how many times people have touched it.
Yeah.
You guys have.
I have a sidebar, right? I can tell you there's a few famous scaffolds at Brand Safeway that have been built and torn down and rebuilt and torn down 8 or 9 times on the same project. So 5 or 6 years ago, we were all learning, right? Maybe 7 or 8. At some point, it becomes our duty to point out there's a better way to do that, right? And so within that, how many times did someone go to the yard and get those 300 pieces of scaffold, set them on an apron, put 250 of them up, pick up 50, take them back to the yard, over and over and over again. So certainly there's plenty of upside in that arena for sure.
Yeah, so great. I got one other question. This looks like one. The application of lean is the ideal, but in my experience, the risk severity of not having materials available on site to meet construction demand is always a worse financial impact than the waste costs of the additional laydown space, additional overhead, and managing those materials. So unfortunately, the default tends towards accepting the waste to mitigate risks to the project schedule. So, anybody got a comment on that before I jump in?
I mean, it's very sensible. Like, it is true in general, delaying the project schedule is a lot more expensive than having a certain percentage of extra materials, but that, like, we can do better, right? If we have the data and if we have the procedures and if we're doing it right, we can push closer to that thing. It's like playing the Price is Right. Yeah, it's going over is worse than going under, but that doesn't mean you lowball your price by a factor of 30%. And we go on for some kind of.
Yeah, I think this is where, when you talk about production management, and contracting management, really getting down to working with your supply chain and looking at the reality of things. What is that right buffer of time, right? If we really want that zero variability at the work phase, what do I need to do up front, and how should I receive things, right? Can be worked out. One of my first jobs on from the lean production side, we had precast that was supposed to arrive, and it didn't. We were informed like a week before, hey, I'm sorry, but none of this stuff's going to arrive, when we wanted it. It's going to be a month late. Here we are, ready to accept it, right? And the team decided it was better to shut the project down for the month, and this was a smaller project, so a little easier. Otherwise we could have had more work area to go to, and we would have done that. Rapidly replan. And then they said, we have a plan. Let's stick to the plan. So let's get the material here, and then let's start up again on this project site. And it's the concept of that we can really drive better project delivery at the end of the day and save a lot of time and money and that thing. And that's exactly what happened. And this was a 12-month job, and the projects, even with the delay, got delivered in 10 months, right? And still saved everybody a lot of money. So the fact is, we have to rethink, our project delivery program. What are we trying to achieve? Look out in the field and see lots of inventory that I'm going to spend a whole bunch of money looking at, but I know it's out there somewhere, on that one risk. Or do I want to work with the supply chain and say, how do I get you to become highly reliable? And what happens if you fail? Just like what Mark was showing in the tool, is yes, if we can share this information, we can rapidly replan around it if need be. All right. So
hope and prayer doesn't win sometimes, and I understand that question. But I would also make this point: if we allow people to go out and make progress for the sake of progress, then we actually create more problems on the project.
All right. So I think that person said, yeah, buffer variability with lead times and inventory at the job site to support just in time at the work phase. Yes, that's kind of our belief too, is that we got to manage those buffers where we want that variability. How early do you hard allocate for bagging and tagging for a just-in-time delivery to the work front?
But I'll tell you from my perspective, right? What we learned is if we bag and tag or pre-kit too early, we end up with rework and complexity built in to those things done too early. So if there's ever a case for just in time, it is for that lean or bag and tag activity to happen within a day or two of that work activity, because inevitably things change. And if we build that rework into our pre-work, you're taking a double hit, quite honestly. I think that's very close to the work.
Right. Yeah. So I agree. And sometimes if we talk about the rule of thumb of bagging and tagging and collections, being within 2 weeks of the work, okay, that might be the best practice in the industry, but clearly we can do a lot better once we do the allocations, right? Actually, yeah, for the bag and tag, but the allocations can, knowing that it's on site, we can do that as, earlier than that. But the fact is, if we want to get down to that just in time, because as soon as you start putting stuff out in the field, it's subject to all sorts of damage and things like that. But, if crews are going to need it, there's communication. That's why you need technology again, is when are things really ready? When's that team really need the bag and tag materials, right? And if we can deliver within 3 days and they can see the material out there, it'll keep the crews happy, right? It's when they don't see the materials and you think you're going to do just in time, show up that afternoon so they can work the next day. It makes people nervous. So there is the psychology of this. We get that. What was the name of the program that Mark was using in the slides? Mark, what do you call that?
Yeah, it's the Garner platform, the Garner platform. So go to garnercorp.com, and that's where we are.
All right. Okay, I like this one. The challenge is selling these organizations to pull the trigger on these better ways of doing business. Can't agree with you more. And that takes internal efforts and going through buy-ins. What's in it for me? How do I change the corporate policies? Yes, absolutely is needed. But some champion in the organization or some failures drive people to rethink and look at how they're going to, how they're going to change their organization. But yes, it is a challenge, organizational challenge, probably outside of this conversation. Let's see. I think we're a little over here. Let's tackle one more if we can. If a certain material is part of the critical path, how should we manage the risk of not having it in time when applying a just-in-time philosophy? Project might fear of not having it in sight, which I think we just talked about here a little bit. But
Fernando, I think I want to mention one thing. I think the idea of a critical path is a little bit overrated. I mean, we've all seen schedules and we all kind of grew up on critical path, and we're going to be talking about this at the AWP conference next week. Yeah, it's next week.
yeah,
That in any kind of a resource constrained environment, which construction is, we have a limited number of crews and so forth, there's a certain degree of flexibility in the critical path. And so we don't want to overuse that. Obviously, there's critical long lead materials that are needed for a big chunk of work, and losing those and having disruption of those is a problem. And so really in those cases, it's like the eggs, right? In one hand, don't put all your eggs in one basket, but on the other hand, you can also put eggs in one basket and watch the basket carefully. And watching the basket carefully really is about sharing that information and having the visibility into the whole process, not just it started to move, because if it started to move and it's too late, it's too late. It's like, what are the lead ups? What's going on before that? And you need that culture of collaboration to really have that transparency.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about critical path, you're talking about project management, which is very important, of course. But what we fail to look at is production management. How do things actually come together, physically, or move the physical movements, the physical installation, the assemblies. That's the production management, and that sometimes tells a whole different story than a critical path, right? And the risk is really there, and we can manage it if we truly understand the production challenges that we have. Because sometimes the schedule is just not always right? So,
gentlemen, thank you so much. We kept everyone 3 minutes late, and they didn't even drop. They're still with us, so they enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you all for joining us today. Rick, Mark, Fernando, thank you for great content. We look forward to the next one. Everyone, please enjoy your week. Be safe.
Okay,
all right,
thanks
thank
a lot.
you, everybody.
Talk to you later.
Care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.